There was a couple times where I was like, girl, you're being dumb. Well, hello, welcome back to my channel. Just Shauna here to talk about some friggin' books that are coming out in 2024. Except one of them actually I think might have already come out in December of this year. Yes, it did. I'll get to it. These are just a couple of NetGalley ARCs that I recently was approved for and I am trying to stay on top of and not let my ratio fall completely by the wayside again as it did a few years ago. And I just figured to draw attention to them, I would do this separate review wrap-up only with these few books in it. And the first one actually is, unfortunately, a DNF, and this is the one that was published in December of this year, so December 5th, 2023, All the Hidden Paths by Meadows. This is the sequel to A Strange and Stubborn Endurance, which I read right before this and really, really enjoyed. So obviously I wanted to read the sequel. And yeah, I DNF'd pretty quickly actually. 16% in is where I gave up. I was going to give it up to 20%, but I know myself and I doubt that I would suddenly be gripped by it, by the plot within 4%. I mean, crazier things have happened, I guess, but I just wasn't loving where it was going, and it's romance fantasy romance. In the first book, I loved the romance. That was my favorite part, the characters, the character development individually, their personal growth, and then their relationship development. I loved it. It was so sweet, so cute, so adorable, so wholesome, despite there being a lot of dark stuff in that book. Look for content warnings before picking it up, please. And so I didn't love the plot, though, like of the first book. There were issues I saw, things that I thought, that's kind of a plot hole, or just characters doing stuff that made no logical sense for what I had been set up to believe about them in the world for plot reasons and things like that. But I kind of didn't care that much because I really, really liked the two main characters. And then this book started and we had a kind of like understandable-ish lack of communication trope happening. And I say ish because in the first book, these two characters were so warm and open and understanding, giving each other grace, patience, and like so willing to be vulnerable with each other almost immediately. Like it was like they just could tell that the other person was genuine, and so they were a safe person to be vulnerable with. And then we developed it to, you know, being a romance. It's not really a spoiler to say that they stayed together because it's a romance. And so in this one, it felt like a regression that stuff had happened. And that's why I say it's kind of valid because like one of the main characters in particular had some pretty severe like loss and trauma and grief that they were dealing with. I don't know. They had similar things going on in the beginning of the first book. So it just felt like relationship regression for the sake of adding tension. And I wasn't loving that. Because I mostly just loved their relationship, and I didn't really love the plot, without loving the relationship in the first 16% of this one, I figured it probably wouldn't end up being something I was going to be obsessed with. So, DNF'd. Bummer times. I do have another Meadows book on my shelves that I've had for a while, An Accident of Stars. And I'm very excited to read it because of loving the characters as much as I did in A Strange and Stubborn Endurance. The next one is a release coming out in January 25th of 2024, and that is The City of Stardust by Georgia Summers. I've never read anything by this author, but you know, in my perusal of NetGalley when I was adding all the things, the premise just sounded kind of intriguing. The cover was pretty, which caught my eye, and then I read the premise and I was like, okay, I think I could get behind that. I don't really talk about the premise of the last one, but I did a whole review on A Strange and Stubborn Endurance, so I'll link that video so you can check it out. The synopsis of this one is, for centuries, generations of Everleys have seen their brightest and best disappear, taken as punishment for a crime no one remembers, for a purpose no one understands. Their tormentor is a woman named Penelope, who never ages, never grows sick, and never forgives a debt. 10 years ago, Violet Everly's mother left, determined to break their curse, and never returned. Now Violet must find her mother, or she will be taken in her place. To do so, she must descend into a seductive, magical underworld of power-hungry scholars, fickle gods, and monsters bent on revenge. She must also contend with Penelope's quiet assistant, Alexander, who she knows cannot be trusted, and yet to whom she finds herself undeniably drawn. Tied to a very literal deadline, Violet will travel the edges of the world to find Marianne and the key to the City of Stardust, where the Everly story began. So, sounded very whimsical, fantastical, all the things. I was here for it. Overall, I did not have a bad time reading this, but I was confused too often by the plot, and I don't think always because of, like, there's some books that just have that very, like, the Starless Sea, and that's what this has been compared to, I saw after reading it. If I had seen that before, I'd probably been like, eh. But I think in the Starless Sea, what I read of it, which was just a little bit in the beginning, it seemed more like purposeful, just nebulousness due to the very, like, woo writing style. You know what I mean? Like a very up in the clouds. Oh, I don't even know what's real or what's not. Like a magical realism or fabulism writing style. This kind of felt like maybe it wasn't so much that, and it was just kind of confusing because of plot things that maybe didn't make sense and such. And I also just didn't find the characters super compelling for me personally. It just ultimately wasn't exactly my kind of book. I can see it being for other people, but not for me. As far as the characters, I did like the main characters. I mean, Violet is the main character, and she was cool. I liked her as a heroine. I could have really loved her, I think, if she had been developed a little bit more, if I actually felt like I got to know her at her core a bit more. I just didn't really see, like, enough of her personality, you know? And the same with Alexander. He was just kind of there, and him and Violet had some interactions, but I didn't see enough even between them or of them individually to feel like I really got to know their personalities, or to feel like I really got to know why they were so drawn to each other. I just didn't see it. I felt like I knew a random side character named Caspian a little bit better than I knew Violet and Alexander, which was kind of a bummer. And the plot, I really liked the concept of the plot, but the execution of it, it didn't work that well for me. Like I said, I did feel like there were several points where there were kind of plot holes. Things also being glossed over very quickly several times that I felt like required a lot more explanation, or like the scene to be slightly longer because we were just like, oh, that happened, but huh? What? And it wasn't super engaging for me personally. So I ended up giving this one 2.75 stars overall, which isn't a terrible rating for me, but it's just very middle of the road, slightly below exactly middle of the road. I will say there are some minor content warnings that I think are important. I would say a moderate one is kidnapping. There are several scenes where someone comes and takes children. It's not in a violent way, and it's in a very like, come with me, little children, you're gonna be fine, and whatever. But they are technically being taken from their homes. And then very minor, like a brief mention and a brief, oh, we saw this, of torture in general. There's a brief description of some torture of an adult, and then there is a very brief scene where there's child death, and a character sees bodies. There's not an intense description of it, but it is there. And then abandonment, I would say, is a pretty big one if anyone has issues with that. There's a lot of themes of abandonment happening here with the main character and her mother. So there's that. And the next and final one for this video is coming out February 13th, 2024, and that is The Briar Book of the Dead by A.G. Slatter. Another author that I have had on my TBR, some other books, but I have not ever read. The synopsis for this one: to the outside world, Silverton appears not to matter much at all. It sits on a remote mountain pass far from the great cathedral city of Lodalin. It's run by witches who, in the usual scheme of things, would be burnt. Yet a dispensation keeps the Briars safe for one simple... That is some typo in the synopsis here. For one simple reason, though, I think is what we meant to say here. They are the custodians of the threshold between the civilized world and the Darklands, where leech lords hold sway. Vampires are especially feared by the ecclesiastics, for leeches steal souls as well as bodies, and mortal souls are the church's most valuable currency. However, things are changing in Silverton, with new forces coming into play and ancient mysteries and sins refusing to stay buried. And Ellie Briar, the first non-witch born into the family for 300 years, will find herself at the center of the maelstrom. I feel like this might be an old synopsis because it also has a different name for the main character. It says Annie, but her name is definitely Ellie. So that's the general idea, though. And I will say, upon hearing that, you might think that vampires are going to be a big thing. No, they are not. They do exist, and it's like we hear mention of the leech lords and the leech lords' Darklands, and oh, they stay over there, and we stop them from coming over here. But that's it. You never meet one. You rarely even hear about them doing anything. That's it. So this one was a bit of a surprise for me. I don't go into books expecting to dislike them by any means. But like I said, I was kind of on a roll on NetGalley, just like, that sounds vaguely interesting, let's go. And so I had requested several books that I was kind of like, oh, I hope I like it. It sounds like I could, but it's also a type of book that I don't often love. So I kind of wasn't expecting to love it. I figured hopefully I like it at least. But yeah, I did kind of really enjoy this. Overall, I really enjoyed the themes of this story and how it's all laid out. I mean, very similar thing we've seen before, witches, correlation with women and how women are treated in general, and women having their independence, and in this, the witches having their independence and their freedom. And overall, I just felt like the pacing worked really well for me. In the beginning, it was taking a little bit of time, and in the very first 10 to 20%, I honestly was kind of I don't know. I wasn't feeling like I want to DNF it yet. I was I'm going to give it 40, 50%, but if I keep feeling like this, I probably will want to DNF it. And then quickly, though, it started picking up, and not once after that did I even contemplate DNFing it. And I really just enjoyed, like I said, the pacing and the intrigue. The intrigue was very high. Once things got going, it was just mystery after mystery. And some of the stuff I could see and the main character could see that maybe we're being led astray a little bit here, but I don't quite know how or what we're being led astray about exactly, but just something over here feels a little weird. And I had an idea of a few things like that, characters that I was something is up with that character. They are up to something. And I was correct, but what they were up to had no idea. Had no idea. And things just kind of kept getting revealed, towards the end, that were oh my God, I hadn't even thought of that. Or oh my God, that's so cool. The twists I thought were done really well. So it made it for a very fun, enjoyable time. I do reread frequently, so that's something I've kind of started thinking about when I read books, would I want to reread this? I saw some Storygraph user that has that as part of their template, and I was like, that's probably a good call for me to do too. So rereadability. And this one, I don't know if I would be itching, I need to reread that, but I would, I would reread it. There's lots of books I read that I'm yeah, it was cool, I liked it, but I don't see myself ever rereading it. And then there's ones that I know for sure, City of Girls, where I'm I just want to reread it all the time. And this kind of falls somewhere in the middle here of I could see myself maybe someday wanting to reread it. It's a possibility. The characters, Ellie as a main character, I really liked her a lot. There was a couple times where I was girl, you're being dumb. But not in such a frustrating way that I wanted to put the book down or anything. Just in kind of a fun, enjoying the story and being entertained way. And I did think the side characters were developed well enough for me personally. And the plot, like I said, it did take a little bit for me to really get going with this. But once it did, I was fully pulled in, and I actually read through it pretty quickly. Some content warnings for this one, kind of more graphic, I would say. Murder. We have several murders kind of briefly described. Also suicide. There is like a body found, and we kind of see that. Again, it's not like graphic, but if you're sensitive to that, I could see that being considered graphic. Also, moderate. Death of a parent. There's mention of, you know, characters' parents who have died. And then also kidnapping. There's mention of that happening. We don't see it happening necessarily, but it's there. Minor things, I would say, are animal death. We hear about like sacrifices and like animals being used. Kidnapping again. Pedophilia and incest. It's a very, very brief mention, like one character just vaguely, oh, this is a thing that happened through these years when I was a kid. And it's all in very like vague terms, but you know what they're saying. And then also child death and child abuse in general. And I guess kind of like torture briefly, and that I would say is like moderate. So, oh, and also death by like fire, burning. That is a thing, as you may imagine, in a story about witches. So be aware of those things if you're interested in this. But yeah, I ended up giving this 4.25 stars, which is pretty dang high for me. So that's what I mean when I say this was a surprise. I certainly wasn't like going into it like, I'm gonna hate this. But I kind of was like, I don't know if this one will be exactly for me, but like hopefully. And I quite enjoyed it. It was very, very entertaining, I felt. And there we have it. Those are the 3 NetGalley ARCs that I wanted to talk about today. And hopefully I will have more soon because I need to read them. If any of these sound intriguing to you, definitely check them out. Pre-order, all that stuff. Request it from your library. I'm going to be trying to do a lot more of that next year. Let me know down below if any of them do sound intriguing to you and if you plan on picking them up or adding them to your anticipated releases or anything like that. Or, of course, just leave an emoji if you want to say, hey, maybe leave a little witch or something. As always, thank you so much for your time. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.